So, welcome to Effortless Content Migration with Migrate Default Content. So, who? I'm David Pascoe-Deslauriers. I'm the CTO of Coldfront Labs, and I really like the Migrate Default Content module. All right, so what? Migrate Default Content. So, in short, the Migrate Default Content module is a module that automatically creates migrations for you based on YAML files. And it does it magically. It also has a few other features, and you can export content to YAML as well with it. But its main thing is it creates migrations. I really like this module enough to do a talk about it at DrupalCamp because it saves me tons and tons of time. But to get started, there's a few things you have to know. What are migrations? So part of Drupal, there's a module in Drupal core called Migrate, and it is a framework to create migrations. And it is a system for writing methods that automatically import content from anywhere, it's pluggable, into anything in Drupal. And it has an entire framework of systems in there to track records so that it knows which record got imported into what content in Drupal, so it can manage duplicates, it can do high water migrations, so that if you have a data source that is out people are adding to, you can migrate. You can continuously migrate, get in the new stuff. You have some options for it so that it can watch that data source. And if it sees things that have disappeared, it'll delete them because it remembers what it migrated. It has rollback, so it could delete any of the content that it migrated in. So it's a really neat system. If you're doing migrations for data into Drupal, you should probably be using Migrate. And yeah, it's a fantastic system for getting stuff into Drupal in a repeatable way. The other part that's super important to know is what is YAML. If you've worked with Drupal, you definitely have used YAML before, but YAML is a data serialization language. It's a way of taking data and storing it as a file. But the idea with YAML is that it's easy to read. And because it's easy to read, it's sort of also easy to write. It's not specific to any programming language. It's meant to be very generic. Parsing YAML is actually quite complex because lots of fun things are allowed that make it easy for humans to read and easy to write to. Like some of the fun things about YAML is they've set up the language so that JSON is a subset language of YAML. So all JSON is valid YAML. So if you have a JSON file, your YAML parser can load it as if it were YAML. So super convenient. But the nice thing about it is it's very easy to emit YAML. And that's a trick that will come in useful later. All right, so why would you use Migrate Default Content instead of writing a regular migration or doing something else? So one of the use cases for Migrate Default Content is structural content. So most sites are completely empty and non-functional when they don't have content. Because menu links are content, and blocks can be content, and your footer is content, and some of your pages, like your landing page, that's content too. Taxonomy terms for tagging things, that's all content. All of these things are content. So if you do a fresh install of the fancy site that you just built, you wrote all these features for, you exported the config, you do a site install, and there's nothing there. It is just the admin bar because everything that holds it up is content. It's really nice to have a way where you can package all that content that you need to hold up the basic site along with the site so that anybody else who's bootstrapping this application has something to go on. And this stuff helps being there from a fresh install. So another time where this module is super useful is test content. Sometimes you need to generate some really complicated or very specific stuff to test certain things. And it's too complicated for devel generate. Devel generate will create, you pick it a target content type, and it'll generate just garbage into all of them to fill up your site with stuff. But sometimes that's not really what you need. You need things to not be random but valid, but look sort of valid. And so that it fills out the site, and especially if you're developing a new feature, you need it to sort of make sense. Or if you're demoing a feature you're developing, you can't have lorem ipsum, or what devel generate just uses a lot of uses ipsum and random strings to fill everything out. And it doesn't look right to people who don't know what they're looking at. So sometimes it's nice to have that. While you're developing, the content, your structure of the content is going to change. And so you need a way to roll back all your test content, change it, and then re-import it. The other thing, too, about test content is if you're a bigger team working on the same feature, you need a way of sharing that test content among everybody who's working on it, so they all have the same thing they're seeing. And if you're handing something off, you need to be able to give it to them. The other thing that's kind of useful is generative AI systems happen to be really good at creating YAML. So you can ask generative AI, like ChatGPT, to give you lists of things and then format them in YAML with these fields. And it does it pretty well. And so you can generate very realistic looking stuff with AI to test with. Another good use of Migrate Default Content is if you have very simple migrations. So in your site, if you have taxonomy, usually it's a fixed set of terms. Usually the only data on that is what the term's name is. Writing migrations for this is a bit of a pain for how much you get at the end, especially if you have a lot of terms. Using just the regular migrate system and writing sort of the migration plugin and all of that, it's a lot of work to bring in 6 terms from another Drupal site or something like that. Whereas it would be easier if you just paste it in a YAML file. The other use case for this module is replacing really complex migrations. Some data sources you're migrating to, especially if you've written a lot of migrations, don't map to Drupal well or at all. They could have problems where the data needs serious amounts of transformation. There's a large amount of the data set that's irrelevant. And so if you connect Drupal to it, you're going to have a lot of work just filtering in terms and writing all these processes to do that, where it might be easier to write a separate process that selects only what you want, emits some YAML, and then boom, you've got your migration done. And the last use case for this module I'm going to talk about is weird content. There's a lot of times where we're bringing in data from weird or stupid places, and it's very difficult to write migrations from things that either don't have APIs, that's the word. They don't have APIs, they don't have data structures, it's just random and takes processing. Or there's APIs that are not available where the Drupal site is. And so the Drupal site can't even access that data to migrate it. Or it's an API that has request limits. So you don't want your CI constantly pounding some API to grab data every time it bootstraps to do some tests and costing you money on your API key or something like that. Or there's a million other situations. Or maybe you want to package data along with your site so that the import can happen during CI so that you can run front-end tests in your CI and have content there. So for some of these solutions, there's alternatives that exist that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. So the big one is the default content module, not to be confused with the Migrate Default Content module. Default content and most of its code actually got merged into Drupal core. Well, forked, and part of it is in Drupal core, and it's what powers recipes or default content in recipes. We're talking a bit about that. We have a panel on Starshot because recipes are part of Starshot. But the part that is important there is default content lets you take any kind of entity, store the whole thing as YAML in a YAML file, and then that module will manage creating content based on that YAML file. And it's one piece of content per YAML file. And recipes work that way too. So if you have a recipe that you want to run that creates some content in a site, it uses default content. So you put all the content you want it to create in there, and it will just merge it in. The reason I'm not doing a presentation on this module is because it doesn't have nearly the features and flexibility that migrations do. Migrations let you control how they're imported. They let you select which records get imported. They let you roll back migrations. So you can roll them back, change something, re-import them. You get a lot of that. This module also lets you do other things to the migrations while it's coming in. And it's a lot easier to manage a huge amount of content is big YAML files as opposed to every entity inside its own YAML file. Yeah, someone pressed it. Blue means recording, right? No, it doesn't. Red means, but it was pulsing red before. Okay.
I was just told to make sure people were recording.
When did it stop pulsing red? Uh-oh.
Okay.
All right. Anyone watching this on YouTube is going to have problems. Sorry. Take two. All right, we're restarting. All right, so where? Well, we got into the important part. How do you actually use this thing? So you enable the module. You create a directory at the root of your Drupal site called default content, and then you do stuff, and you profit, and you're done. No, that's not quite it. So the way that this module works is it heavily relies on being magical, which is sort of nice. The files that you put in there, the YAML files, they need to just have magic names. So the names of your YAML files that go in default, it says default config. Oh no. Okay, I had it right there. We're going to go back and make sure these slides are right. Default content. There we go. Now no one will be confused. The names of the files you put in there are named entity type dot bundle, which is the machine name for the type of thing they are. So if you have a node type or content type called basic page, your file name is called node.basicpage.yaml. Or if it's taxonomy terms you're migrating, it's taxonomy term dot, and then tags being the vocabulary, .yaml. And when those files exist, they magically generate migrations for them. So how do they look? Inside the file, it's an array in YAML. So we get our first peek of YAML syntax if you haven't seen it. The dashes indicate a new, they indicate an array. The colons indicate that this is a hash or a structure, so it's a key value structure. So what we're looking at here is there's an array of objects, well, an array of hashes or objects, depending on how we want to call them. The first element in it has a key called title, and a key called body, and a key called status. And then title is the string node title. Body is another object that has a key called value and format, and then status has just the value 1. So this is how you store things. It sort of gives you a look inside Drupal, how Drupal stores things. Most text fields have a value and a format. The value is the text content, and then the format is the format that it's rendered with. So if you have the drop-down box that says like basic HTML or full HTML or plain text, that's the format. And so this is how things are stored. So let's take a look at what this looks like in a Drupal site. So what I've done is I have a fresh installed Drupal site, but I wanted something that ChatGPT could create content for. So I created a list of terms called ship type. It has no fields, it's just a taxonomy term. Then I went to ChatGPT, and I said, give me a YAML list of spaceship types with the type in the key name. And then it said, sure, and it gave me this. So if I go into my Drupal site, oops, well, we're going to need that. Oh, just to show this, if I do, oh, that's probably too small, and that's too big. So Drush MS is Drush Migrate Status. This lists the current migrations and their status on the site. I have no migrations. If I create a directory, oops, how do I do that here? We're just going to create a directory here. Default content. There it is. And I create, oh, it's up there. VS Code, why are you able to do this? There we are. So here's my YAML file for my taxonomy terms. It's just copied out of ChatGPT, but sort of formatted throughout the root. It's an array of things where they have name and then something. So we're now just going to stick this inside my default content directory. Yes, we're going to move it. And then a command that all Drupalers know well, drushcr, which is cache rebuild. I'm telling Drush just to erase its cache, because the migrations that are available are cached by Migrate Default Content. But now, when that file is there, if I run Drush Migrate Status again, I have a migration for 20 terms. And so I can go ahead and import it. So this is Drush Migrate Import, and I'm going to just say run all migrations. It creates 20 terms, and I go back into my site, and I have all my things imported from the file. So pretty fast for writing migrations. There we are. Let me get out of the slideshow. So what else can you do with this thing? Another important thing for migrations is translations, because we need to import the translation of things. So to mark a migration and give a migration a language, it's again just giving the file a magic name. So we have, instead of just being entitytype.bundle, we give it the name entitytype.bundle.langcode. So the only other thing to know is to mark that entry as a translation of another entry. We have to put a translation or override key in it. And I didn't specify something, which I probably should. This module is automatically aware of other migrations that it is managing. And it does that with another bit of magic. And that bit of magic is the first key of an object becomes what it uses for that object's unique key. And this can be a double-edged sword, especially if you have nodes or things with the exact same name. Then it won't import the duplicates. But this lets you refer to them by this. So if I have any other migrations that refer to node title, I just call it node title. I don't need any numbers or figure out what it is. If there's an entity reference that points to that node type and I call it node title, Migrate Default Content knows how to find it. So that is actually used in translations. So when you write the translated version of name, you need to have translation origin, and translation origin just points to the thing that you're translating based on what its key is. So we can actually generate that again with ChatGPT, and you just ask it to translate that into French and add a translation origin record to each of the records that has the English value. And ChatGPT says, sure, why not? I won't vouch for the quality of the translations, but the YAML was good. So, I mean, what are you going to do? What's that?
Works on my machine.
Works on my machine, exactly. The translations are not bad. They're quite good given the effort I spent getting them. Yeah, so it's just a matter of copying that. So here's our YAML in the end. We have all of our names, and then we have our translation origin, which points to the names of the things that are there. So we need to just drop that in our Migrate Default Content directory. And there we are. So once again, I need to clear the cache so that Migrate Default Content scans it. And I do migration status. We have two migrations now. So it has the English one as the French one. If I import them all, oh, that was there. And now when we go to French, there we are. We have French words for all of our terms. And that's it. And now this is just files. I can include this with my code base. So all the other developers on this project, when they get this, they can do a fresh install and then migrate and then get the content. One of the really super cool things you can do is write stuff like this. Existing config and drush migrate all. So drush SI is drush site install. This wipes the database clean, reruns the install, looks at your exported config, and does the install of that. And then my second command, the end, says, if that works, then rerun all the migrations. So I can just do install a new site, give it that time, and it'll just rerun it. And now we're back to exactly where we were before with the content we had before. And we'll let this run. It shouldn't take too long. There we go. Oh, translations. That's what's going on. So yeah, when you do a site install and you have multiple languages enabled, it downloads all the translations and then imports those so that your site can be in French. Ah, there we are. So the site's there. Because we erased the database, we are no longer logged in. So let's log in. I'm in there, fresh install, and if we go to structure, taxonomy, oh, this terms, yeah, it's all there. All our stuff's there. Okay. So next thing you might want to do is files. Some of your content references files. And once again, this was just magically supported. You just stick a files directory in your default content directory, and then you stick your files in that directory. And then on fields that are filed fields, you just put the value to be the name of the file. And then when it does the migration, it automatically recognizes that it's migrating in a file, and it goes to look for the file in that directory, and then slurps it into Drupal, and then Drupal copies it into your site's default files directory, or wherever you have. If that files thing is set to be in the private files, it'll go there. It goes wherever it's configured to. You can override where it is if it has subdirectories, the same way you would be able to do in any migration, except for it's easy. You just stick it in the YAML, and it finds it. The other thing is that entity references are automatically detected. So like I mentioned before, you just have to refer to the reference by the thing that you imported by whatever its key name was, and it automatically links it up. So we can take a look at that. So one of the other things to fill this out and make a bit more of an example, ask for decide we're going to make a Starship registry site. So I asked it we need some users for this site. So I said, give me some ship captains, because we're going to migrate in users with this thing. And the users, their username is called name. They need an email address, so mail. And they need a status, whether or not they can log in. You need to set that one for users, otherwise they're blocked, because the default status for users on those sites is 0. So I asked ChatGPT to give me a list of Starship captains with these and their status set to 1. And it was like, yeah, sure, why not? And so it generated this file. Just a matter of copying that in. So because we're loading users, we put it in a file called user.user.yaml, because user is the entity type, but user is also the bundle. You don't know that you usually see other bundles of user. I'm not sure if that's a thing, but it's still, that's what they are, that's the name. So you put it in a file called user.user, here's my list of users. We put it in our default content directory. And clear cache. And we have our user migration. Same thing with, if we have files, we've created a content entity that stores the registrations. So there's a field to connect the captain, there's a field for the name of the starship, and there's a field for a picture. So our pictures are all of these files. So let's put our files into their default content directory. So it'll magically be there. Because we're fancy, we're actually going to store our files as media because we want them to have alt tags and everything built in. So here's our media migration for this. So the media actually stores the file and the alt tag. So here's my media elements. They all have silly names. This is where ChatGPT stopped doing the work, you can tell. It doesn't do images like that. But yeah, you can see my files. It has the file, just the name of the file, the alt tag, the name of the alt tag, and a list of all those. You just bring that one into default content. And then here's my spaceships in my registry. I believe, there we are. Give me a YAML list of some spaceships that match those captains, and the field type matches the field type list. And it was like, sure. And then put in a bunch of brand new field ship types in there, because that was very nice of it. And then my migration was like, hey, I've imported 12 new things of 10. It's like, oh, right, because ChatGPT can't be trusted, but it generated valid YAML still once again, so we'll forgive it. But same sort of thing. We've got an entity reference to, in field images is a media field. So we have a piece of media called USS Enterprise. Oh, that's ship type. If you look at media, it maps here to USS Enterprise. This will automatically figure it out. It also knows where things reference to what, and so it sets the correct dependencies on all the migrations, and will load them in the right order so that everything exists where it needs to exist. So here's my spaceships. So we'll just, we're right-clicking, aren't we? All right. We'll bring it in here. Yes. So we got all of that in there. Oop. So just clear the cache again. You can look at our migrations. So now we have all these migrations from all the YAML files. We just do drush migrate all. It knows the order, so we can just slurp them all in. And then, not there, that's ChatGPT. If we go into our site and we look at content, we have, it's not the default page. Just go to the node page because it's easy enough. Oh, node 1 is there. But if we go to the node page, we have all of the content all migrated in. And once again, you can do things like this, where you completely make some config changes, didn't like them, run this, wipe them all out, import all your content again, and it is super easy to do. So let's talk about some case studies. So why? So this is how it works. Why do you use it? Here's the places where I've really found it useful. So one of them is my 3-hour D7 to D10 upgrade. We had a site that was essentially our leave calendar. It's the vacation calendar for the company to say who's off, when, and where. It's not a really complicated site. It has a calendar, it has a content type called leave, and then it has users. Not a whole lot on this. So the functionality is pretty easy. We book the events, the leave events, have a start day and an end day, and that's it. And then they're associated to a user. Oh, yeah.
Was it dynamic?
The calendar, yeah, like users logged in and can set their stuff, and it stores in the content management system. Oh, yeah, like they can go and edit it. It just ends up being a calendar. But it was in Drupal 7, so I needed to migrate it. And it was, for theme, it was just using the same theme as our website. So the functionality was easy to write. didn't have to theme anything. One of the big problems, though, is that if anyone's done any work with Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, 9, 10, is that date ranges changed significantly between the two and are not compatible. And to get all of the really cool calendar features, you have to use Smart Date, which Martin, who gave the keynote, is actually the maintainer of. So it does a lot of cool stuff. But it does not work anything like date rangers did in Drupal 7. So here I was, I managed to whip this thing together really, really fast. And now I needed to migrate all the content into it. Well, migrating the users is pretty easy. But how am I going to, I have to write a migration for all of these entries. And then I thought about it and I was like, hey, why not migrate default content? Can I write a SQL query that emits something close enough to YAML that will import? And it turns out I could. And I wrote a SQL query that merged a bunch of the tables together, output the YAML, and done. Created my YAML file, saved it in the other site. The migration is done. Everything's ready to go, instead of having to write a migration or do any really hard work. Another time I found this really useful is recently a client was moving a bunch of PDF manuals onto their website. What they needed for this is some custom navigation to get through these things. That works sort of like Book, but in a way that they wanted customized. So there wasn't really a good solution for this, so we're building a custom navigation for it. To make the custom navigation work and test it out, you really need example like data that looks like the thing that it's going to be to try it out. And these are very, very long manuals, like hundreds of pages. So you need to be able to see it and make sure everything works. So you don't need all the content in there, but you do need enough content. And you don't want the clients to start doing their migration because you might want to change the structure of it if you find out, oh, the modules I'm using to let them build this are not going to work. So what I did was, hey, migrate default content. Makes it easy. I went to the table of contents in the PDF, copied the table of contents into a file, wrote a little find and replace that looked for new lines, and turned it all into YAML. Did mostly by adding keys and little dashes in front of everything. And I had a migration that would turn the entire table of contents into nodes in Drupal of the right type. Just need to name the file. And then, bam, I've got my test content that looks enough like the real content to try it out. And the other benefit of that is once I'd written all the functionality, it had some theming issues that needed to happen. And I wanted to hand it off to one of our other developers who is much better at theming than I am. That would be very difficult if that was just in my environment and I got it in another way. But because I was using Migrate Default Content, I just committed the YAML files to the code directory, to the repo, and then he pulls down the branch, runs the migrations, and now he's got exactly the same test content I did. And you can see exactly what he does, what I was seeing to develop the rest of the to theme the rest of the feature. Another use case I found for this. There was an API. It was a valid API. Had some data that we needed to get into a site. That API was only accessible from a specific network. The data that we were getting was not private data. The API it was attached to was not public. So there's no way to get it. And there's no way for this Drupal site while it was running to reach through this network and get this data. That's not true. There was ways to do that, but the security guy would burst a bud vessel, and he'd be right to do it. But what is easy enough to do is write just a brief little script you can package along with your Drupal site in the scripts directory that says, hey, developer, because you have access to this API, just run this. And that little script, all it did was generate the magic YAML file with all the data, stick it in the default content directory, and yeah, there's a manual step of occasionally when the data gets updated, somebody's going to have to update the migration file in it, but it wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And that way we have a migration, and then when live in production, if the data needs to change, you just run a migrate import -- update, it slurps in all the new data, and away you go. Another use case where I found this module really useful is having a whole site in local dev. If sometimes you have sites with a lot of really interconnected stuff, really complicated content types, lots and lots of fields, doing lots and lots of weird things. And those sort of things are sort of the base part of the site. And it may be that the content authors aren't even writing those. But you want to have them in all the local dev. So these sort of default content migrations, you end up with some complicated YAML to generate them, but you've got them stored in YAML files. Everybody who's working on it gets exactly the same thing. If they need to get updated, you just update them in the YAML. Everybody does an import update, and you have all the files you need. Well, is that time? No, we're good? All right.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. And this also means that during development, developers can do full reinstalls of their site, then just do the migration. They have all the content. They get to do all the testing that they need. It's really helpful if you're going to try things out, change the data structures of things. If you didn't like it, blow it all away. You're not blowing away the content that you need to test the site. And you can sort of separate those things out and keep the content and start treating some of that content like config. Obviously, you don't want to do that with all content, but it's nice to do it with some. Okay, and it's got to remember what all these things are. So another case study that I have is mapping content that doesn't really map well. So I was working on something where the content that we wanted to migrate into Drupal, or I wanted to migrate into Drupal, was stored in this React app. Cool. Except that apparently React developers don't use data structures in the back end. Just all their data is code. And you go into their files, it's all variable this, and they built it all out as code that executes. Well, that kind of sucks. I wish I could load what their data was, but I can't. It's JavaScript, or TypeScript, really. So that's brutal. How am I going to get this thing? Well, I can look at the app running, and I know the app has the data, and I can see where the app lists the data. So if I'm in the app, and because it's JavaScript, I can hit F12 and open the JavaScript console. Since I can hit F12 and open the JavaScript console, I can interact with the data structures the app has built to manage rendering out the page. So if I can tap into that, I can use an each and have it hack together some JSON into a string, or hack together some YAML into a string, and then copy and paste that YAML out of my JavaScript console into a magically named file, and my migrations are done from somewhere that would have been pretty impossible to migrate data out of. And then it becomes trivial. All right, some advanced features in the module, because the basic features are all there. You have YAML files, they magically become migrations, and you can migrate them in. So once you start doing this a lot, you start wanting to do the reverse. Export content into YAML. If you use the 3.x branch, which is alpha, but it's actually pretty stable, you can use it. There's a submodule called the Migrate Export Content. That's the one. What it will automatically do is you tell it what content types, and you can filter by content type, you can filter by bundle, you can filter by ID, and it'll go through your site and export all of those into YAML. So you can get into a really interesting loop if you wanted. This might be overdoing it, but there's probably a context and a site where this makes a lot of sense, especially if you're delivering a site that has features and content together and you're just being like, here, then we're done. You can have somebody writing content in the site, and then they can export it, just like they would do an export of config, or perhaps even along with their export of config. And then they have the content and the config stored along with the site. And you can work on those both at the same time as you're authoring content in the site as it's being developed. It's a special use case where the client's not writing the content, and they're part of the site development, writing the content as the site's going. But yeah, you can use that. Or the other way too is sometimes the Drupal interface for writing content is better than YAML. And you would like something to be YAML, but it's just easier to write it in the Drupal interface, especially if you have lots of fields. You can just use this module to export it. Times like that are when you want to export things that have like markup in them. Writing markup just inside of a record in YAML is less fun than writing it in Drupal. So it's easier to write out the content you want and then export it. The other fancy feature you get in the 3x branch is you can use it to export the migrations that are generated. So the way that my Migrate Default Content works under the hood is that it scans the YAML files and then it programmatically generates migrations for each of the files that it sees there. You can actually ask Migrate Default Content for those migrations. So you can turn them back into regular migrations without writing them. And so there's a drush command that lets you export those migrations so that you can work on them later. So if you want to use your YAML migration as a base or change something about it, you can do that. And the last sort of really advanced feature that there's not really documentation for, I'm one of the maintainers on the module now. I took it over like this year. So it's my fault. I need to write the documentation for this feature. But we found it in the code, is that the migrations that get generated can actually be patched. So if you want the migrations from those YAML files to like transform data values or do other things, you can actually do that by just writing those parts. So you can add an overrides directory to your default content directory, and in those files, put the name of the generated migration, and just put the things that you'd like to change about the migration that gets generated, and it will patch that migration before it gives it to Drupal. And so you can override the migration. So if you need your default content migrations to do really complicated stuff, or if they're sort of growing in functionality, you can do that. So it sort of future-proofs you in case you're like, oh, we're just going to start with this. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, I needed more functionality. Do I rewrite migrations? Well, you don't actually have to. You can just patch in the functionality that you need. Or export the whole migration and then convert it away from being a default content migration. So that's pretty useful. All right. So that's about it for the default Migrate Default Content module. So are there any questions? Okay. Yeah, we'll go over there. Brian, right?
Yeah. With the last bit, the override, does that work if you have a site and then all of a sudden you have a new field, you have to add a new content type, and the client hands you a spreadsheet with new content for the field for 2,000 nodes? Is that can you put that new field and that data into those existing nodes?
So I would do it the other way. I'd stick it into the actual YAML.
So pull out the YAML and then.
Yeah, I just regenerate the YAML based on their new spreadsheet.
Right.
Probably the easiest thing. Yeah, because like that's the nice thing about it. If there are fields inside your YAML that don't map to anything, Migrate Default Content ignores them. If there are fields in your content that aren't in your YAML, Migrate Default Content just lets them get filled out by whatever the default is. This can kind of screw you over if you have like a node type and its like default is to not be published, but like everything from Migrate Default Content probably wants to be published, and then you make that change, and then all of a sudden everything it migrates isn't published. And it's because you have to go back into your YAML and add the status one on all your records so that they come in as published. But yeah, I would sort of handle it like that. I've found the overrides are mostly for the data is coming in like one way, and then your client is like, oh, well, actually, they're all supposed to be uppercase. And then you can just be like, okay, on this field, the first thing you do is you add a process plugin and you use the uppercase, like callback on. And then it's sort of easier. Yeah, because with new fields, the other thing you could do, actually, is if you had a field that wasn't in the YAML that had to be got calculated dynamically, you could sort of just have the process plugin add that new field. And so, like if there's a new field that was computed, obviously if it's computed, and you could pre-compute it, so it could be in the YAML, you can have the code in there, and so it gets patched in and does things like that.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
But, Patricia?
I have a question about the start with the layout business. So that is suppose a layout builder. Suppose on top of layout builder, we are using activity block. Where
Yeah.
we want to have the node as block active, and then we will also have use some contributed node where we want to do a customized attribute to the layout. So how it will go?
So this is one of those times where the export content is really important. The 3.x branch supports Layout Builder. So Layout Builder is part of the content. It will export your customized layouts in with your nodes, and will import your customized layouts from YAML in with the nodes. So the 3.x branch has you covered for that. It supports Layout Builder for inline layouts. So that one's a rough feature, because that is definitely, nobody is hand hacking a layout into a YAML file, and I don't think ChatGPT is either. But that way does work. So in the 3x, that's one of the ones where you'd export, but you can absolutely export and import them. So I think Dan, you had a question.
Yeah. One of the things I've encountered, as you pointed out in the beginning, when doing migrations, is the sort of work of having to deal with the migrate modules and stuff that you have to generate. And it sounds like this is sort of doing auto-generating a lot of that.
It's auto-generating a lot of that, yeah.
Can you then, once that's done,
Yeah.
you can then go in and customize those.
Yes.
You can use it sort of almost like a recipe, right?
You can. Yeah.
Like you can start from there, and then if you've got something you know the only way that's going to work is to actually would have been to have a migrate module for that particular entity or something.
Yeah. You can absolutely do that. So that's very rare that I've ever been in that situation. Yeah, mostly this module is really great for all those migrations where you don't have to do that. Mm-hmm. You just have the data. You want to get data into Drupal, and you don't want it to take the afternoon. And this is the module for you. Saves months of time.
But also, if you have many entities,
yeah,
and you have an easy way to get a YAML extraction, like you showed a couple of your examples where you could grab that from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And then sort of auto-generate your stuff as a starter, and then you can go from there.
You can absolutely do that.
Use this for that.
Yeah.
Which thanks.
Yeah.
So we have a YAML extraction from a bag that was just pushed from any business unit. Bags contains images with the CSS attached to it.
Yeah.
If we overwrite the whole process, then we need to keep those files in the actual default content server, or is it YAML, or is it in a Drupal default server? We need to overwrite at one point.
So
I did the migration.
Okay, you did the migration already.
Yeah. I just did the migration with this module.
Oh, you use this module. Okay, excellent. Yeah. Okay, you did that.
So, but then if I need to overwrite, after all, I need to keep those files in the server.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to re-import them, they have to be there, but they're outside of your web root generally, and so it's okay. And after, once you're in production, you're not really running your migrations again, or at least you're rarely. I mean, there's situations you can be in, but most of the time, once you're in production, if they're migrations you never need again, you can go ahead and delete them, and then the migration is gone, and it's content in Drupal now, and it's Drupal's problem. So that's totally fine too. But yeah, normally it doesn't hurt anything. They're not too big. You can just leave them there, and they just become part of the code that supports the site, and they're useful for future developers who want to import everything. So, yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for modules that export YAML from Drupal 7 sites?
Modules that export YAML from Drupal 7 sites.
Is there a use module?
There's lots of different ways to get data out of Drupal 7 sites. The trick for data out of Drupal 7 sites is not so much getting it out, but figuring out the transformation to get it to where it's going to be. And that's always the work for most migrations. Well, I mostly talked about skipping over that part in this presentation, but really, like, that's the big part of web migrations. If you have source data, once you know how it's going into Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, 10, whatever, 10, 11. There we are. 11 as of today. It's like when it's a new year.
Yeah.
Instead of start saying 2024. No, when it's going into Drupal 11, like once you know that, then you can start writing the YAML because like the names have to match the new names. There's lots of ways of getting data out of the Drupal 7 sites. Once you know where it's going, getting the data out is not usually your problem unless your transformations are. Because the data, worst comes to worst, you're going from a content management system. It's all managed. It's all in database tables. You're probably fine. You can resort to SQL queries. D2D, the Drupal 7 migrate modules that come with Drupal 11 now, the way they work is they just connect to the Drupal 7's database, and they understand its table schema, and they slurp in the data from there. But at the same time, what you're writing is the transformations and your transformation migrations to load like, oh, like all of this now goes here because the data structures are what's heavily different. So yeah, sidestep your question entirely and say that's not what your problem is going to be. No, it's fairly easy. There's lots of stuff to get data out of Drupal 7, and like my Drupal 7 migration case study, I was looking at different ways of doing it, and I ended up just writing a SQL query that dumped data that looked like YAML. And it was good enough. I got the data out, and it made it into a YAML file. And luckily, with this module, that means I'm done. Work's over.
A note on this Migrate Default Content module is you're generally wanting to import, I assume, static data, right? Like data that's not changing all the time. Because if you were migrating data that's having information added to it or being changed all the time, you would simply use the migrate module instead, right?
Yes, yeah.
The idea is that this is default
So,
content that is unchanging.
Yeah, the idea too, it doesn't change, and it needs to, because like these are YAML files that are committed along with the repo. So if you need to connect to the data source, it has to be live. And I've got to go moderate a panel right now. So thank you very much. See you later.